Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If a civilization survives for thousands of years and then suddenly becomes afraid to assert itself, what changed? Not the Vedas, not the Upanishads, not the depth of Sanatana Dharma. What changed was confidence. And when confidence collapses, a civilization starts calling its own survival controversial. Tonight I'm defending Hindutva, not as a slogan, not as a party line, but as civilizational clarity, as civilizational self respect, as civilizational adulthood. Every civilization is allowed to protect itself, except Hindu civilization. Japan protects Japanese identity. Pakistan protects its so called Islamic identity. China protects Chinese continuity. But when Hindus assert Bharatvarsha as a dharmic civilization, the world becomes suspicious. Why? Because a confident Hindu civilization breaks a certain narrative, a narrative that wants Hindus to exist, but only as a soft, apologetic, self correcting ghost of themselves. Hindutva exists to refuse that ghosthood. Hindutva is not a theology, it is not a new scripture, it is not a replacement for Sanatan Dharma. It is the civilizational instinct that says, we will not erase ourselves to earn approval. Now listen carefully. The most dangerous enemy of a civilization is not always external. It is internal confusion. It is internal shame. It is moral paralysis. It is what I call suicidal empathy. Suicidal empathy is not compassion. It is compassion without viveka. It is tolerance without boundaries. It is noble sentiment used as an excuse for strategic blindness. It is when you feel more anxious about being called harsh or hateful than about losing what you are. If that sounds extreme, good, because the consequences are extreme. The Bhagavad Gita was spoken in a moment of collapse. Arjuna saw conflict, and he melted emotionally. He said he cannot fight those he respects. Sri Krishna responded with a sentence that should echo in every Hindu spine. Klebyam masma gamah partha, do not yield to weakness. Notice the precision. Krishna did not praise paralysis as virtue. He did not call collapse peace. He did not call surrender compassion. He called it weakness, and he demanded clarity. This is the dharmic balance. Daya, compassion, and kshatriya, protective strength. Sanatan Dharma is not softness, it is balance. It is the refusal to let adharma rise unchecked. Hindutva is that balance expressed at the level of a civilization. It is the protective reflex of a civilization that says, we will remain ourselves, we will remember ourselves, we will defend our continuity without apology. Now let us get sharper, because the internet loves confusion. So let us remove confusion. Sanatan Dharma is your spiritual framework. It is metaphysical, it is ethical, it is moksha-centered. It is the pursuit of Satya. Hinduism is a modern umbrella label used in global language. Hindutva is civilizational identity and civilizational self-protection. Different domains, overlapping soil, not the same category. And here is why Hindutva becomes necessary. Because a spiritual civilization can be strangled if its civilizational space is weakened. Temples need society. Texts need institutions. Philosophy needs confidence. Pluralism needs an anchor. Now I will say a sentence that may offend fragile modern ears. Offense is cheaper than extinction. Hindutva is not hatred. It is refusal. Refusal to practice suicidal empathy. Refusal to confuse virtue with self-erasure. Let me show you what suicidal empathy looks like. Not in abstract theories, but in civilizational memory. Consider Prithviraj Chauhan, a symbol of valor, a symbol of honor, a symbol of Kshatriya spirit. He defeats Muhammad Ghuri in the first encounter at Tarain. He allowed Ghuri to retreat. A defeated enemy is allowed to retreat because chivalry demanded it, because honor demanded it. Now understand the lesson. Honor is beautiful, but honor without strategic realism can become a trap. Because the world does not always reciprocate your code. Ghuri returned, and he did not return the favor, because to him, Chauhan was just a dirty kafir. This is not an invitation to bitterness. It is a warning against naivete. It is a lesson in civilizational adulthood. You do not hand your throat to history and call it virtue. You protect your future and call it responsibility. Hindutva is the vow to stop repeating that pattern. Now consider 1921 in Malabar. The Mopla or Mappila episode becomes a symbol of another danger. The danger of moral optics. The danger of narrative management. The danger of leaders smoothing reality to preserve a political storyline. When violence and displacement occur, a civilization expects clear moral language. It expects protection for the vulnerable. It expects truth spoken without fear. Yet, political movements sometimes fear fracture more than they fear injustice. Gandhi was committed to ahimsa. He was committed to a unity vision. But the civilizational critique is this: if your moral framework becomes so absolute that it cannot name suffering clearly, then your moral framework becomes performative. And performative morality produces vulnerable victims. Hindutva rejects performative morality. It chooses reality. It chooses accountability. It chooses honest memory. Now pause and ask yourself, how many times has Hindu society been asked to be the bigger person? How many times has Hindu society been told to stay quiet to maintain harmony? How many times has Hindu society been expected to swallow humiliation to prove virtue? This is the mechanism of suicidal empathy. It weaponizes your goodness against you. It turns your tolerance into a leash. The Mahabharata gives you the archetype of this failure. Dhritarashtra. He sees adharma rising. He knows the cost. He hesitates anyway. He delays. He rationalizes. He confuses attachment for compassion. And that paralysis destroys a kingdom. Civilizations die like that too. Not always by one dramatic event, but by 1,000 hesitations, by 1,000 silences, by 1,000 apologies. Hindutva is the refusal of Dhritarashtra's paralysis. Now let us talk about the deepest battlefield, the mind. Centuries of Islamic and colonial rule did not just take resources. It planted inferiority. It taught educated Hindus to see their own devas as myth, to see Sanskrit as dead, to see temples as backward, to see their own civilizational memory as a problem to be corrected. This is psychological colonization, and it has aftershocks. Even after political independence, many Hindus continue to seek external certification for their existence. Hindutva is psychological decolonization. It says, we will not inherit shame, we will inherit memory. We will not whisper our mantras. We will not hide our symbols. We will not treat our own civilization like a guilty secret. The Rig Veda, Ano Bhadra Kratavo Yantu Vishvata. Let noble thoughts come to us from every direction. This is openness. But openness is not self-erasure. Receiving noble thoughts is not the same as surrendering your anchor. Pluralism requires a center. If you remove the center, you do not get pluralism. You get fragmentation. Hindutva protects the center so that plurality can breathe. Now let me anticipate the predictable objection. People will say Hindutva is political, as if politics is automatically dirty, as if civilizational self-protection is automatically immoral. But tell me this, when a family protects its home, is that political or is that common sense? When a community protects its language, is that political or is that cultural health? When a civilization protects its sacred geography, is that political or is that continuity? Hindutva is the language of continuity in a modern world. It is how civilizational instincts speak in the age of nation-states. Another objection arrives. They will say, Sanatan Dharma is universal. Why do you need identity at all? Because universals still require a home. Because philosophy still needs a civilization that carries it. Because dharma does not float in the sky. Dharma is practiced by people. In institutions, in families, in temples, in languages, in customs. And when those carriers are weakened, the universal becomes museum content. It becomes a quote on a calendar. It becomes a yoga class with no roots. It becomes spirituality without civilization. Hindutva says, we will not allow our inheritance to become a souvenir. Now let us talk about how suicidal empathy operates today. Not as violence, not as conflict, as a slow social habit. It shows up as nervous laughter when someone insults Hindu symbols. It shows up as fear of saying, I am Hindu with pride. It shows up as the reflex to over-explain, to over-apologize, to pre-surrender. It shows up as selective scrutiny, where Hindu traditions must be endlessly reformed and justified, while other traditions are treated as untouchable. It shows up when temple culture is treated as backward, but imported ideologies are treated as sophisticated. It shows up when sacred spaces are treated as mere real estate, but other sacred spaces are treated as identity itself. This is not pluralism. This is asymmetry. And asymmetry is how civilizations lose confidence without noticing. Hindutva confronts asymmetry. It says either respect is mutual or the conversation is dishonest. Now, another question. Why do so many Hindus fear being too Hindu? Who taught them that? And who benefits from that fear? Because a Hindu who is unsure of himself is easy to manage. He will compromise first. He will apologize first. He will withdraw first. But a Hindu who has civilizational clarity is stable. He can be pluralistic without being porous. He can be open without being hollow. He can be compassionate without being suicidal. That is what Hindutva is aiming at, a stable civilizational self. Now let me say this in one hard line. The opposite of Hindutva is not peace. The opposite of Hindutva is Hindu amnesia. And Hindu amnesia produces a strange creature, a Hindu who knows other civilizations' histories better than his own. A Hindu who can quote foreign theorists but cannot name his own rishis. A Hindu who fears his own power so much that he calls it dangerous. Hindutva is the cure for that amnesia. It says, remember, not to hate, but to stand. And let me repeat the principle one more time. Suicidal empathy is when your moral instincts are used to disarm you. It is when you mistake self-protection for cruelty. It is when you confuse firmness with hatred. It is when you are trained to believe the highest virtue is to disappear quietly. Hindutva refuses quiet disappearance. It chooses visible continuity. It chooses civilizational confidence. It chooses a Bharat that does not whisper. And if someone says, what about openness? I will answer with the same Vedika prayer. Ano bhadra kratavo yantu vishwata. Noble thoughts. Not self-hatred. Not self-erasure. Not the demand that Hindus must be the only people ashamed of their ancestors. Openness is a strength posture. Weakness imitates openness, but it is actually surrender. Hindutva is openness from strength, not openness from fear. So yes, read widely, engage everyone, listen with dignity, but do not forget your own civilizational center. Because the moment you forget it, you become easy to reshape, easy to shame, easy to fracture. And that is exactly what Hindutva prevents. Now let us end where we began. What changed when Hindus became afraid to assert themselves? Not the Vedas, not the Upanishads, not Dharma. What changed was psychology. Hindutva is the correction of that psychology. It is the refusal of suicidal empathy. It is the restoration of civilizational spine. It is the declaration that Bharatavarsha will remain Bharatavarsha. Now I will leave you with a final question. Where is the line between daya and self-destruction? Where is the line between tolerance and self-erasure? Where is the line between empathy and suicidal empathy? Write your answer in the comments. Because civilizations are not sustained by silence. They are sustained by clarity. Jai Shri Ram. Jai Bharat. Vande Matram.